Okay, so let's start talking about this issue of egoism. And, I think it should be clear why egoism being the claim that people are or should be selfish or self interested. You guys might notice there's a lot of weaseling going on there, a lot of ors. We'll narrow it down, right? If you're suspicious the way I put it, you should be, but just, hold it for a second, right? But egoism, this claim that people are or should be self interested, it does seem an obvious threat to morality as we normally think of it, right? It's going to be a threat to morality as the moral theories we're going to look at in this class thinks of it, but it's also a threat to morality as we normally conceive of it as you thought about morality before you took a class like this, right? And to see why I think of this, right? Imagine that you're walking along one day and you find a wallet with some money in it. Let's make it enough money that it would be tempting to just about anybody, right? I mean, most people don't carry this much cash anymore, but let's say it's $500, right? Nobody's around, nobody sees you pick it up. You could easily strip out the $500, throw the wallet in the trash, go on, right? You could also, the guy's ID's in there, maybe there's something with some phone numbers. You could look him up, you could find him, give the wallet back, right? Even beyond, keeping the money, giving the wallet back is going to be a hassle, right? You're going to have to call this guy, you're going to have to find him, you're going to have to do a lot of work, right? Even if there's no money in there that you want to keep, or that, somehow you're rich enough that $500 isn't a big deal, it's still a hassle to get this guy's wallet back to him, right? But obviously, the morally right thing to do would be to make some effort to get it back to him, right? Obviously, the morally wrong thing to do would be to strip out $500, toss it in the trash, or toss it back where you found it, right? But, what would be in your self-interest? Self-interest, take the $500, right? Self-interest, pretty clearly not making a bunch of calls to strangers. Nobody likes to do that. So, obviously, your self-interest is in conflict with what morality tells you to do here, right? And in a lot of cases, morality and self-interest are going to be at odds. So if people really should be self-interested, or they're just by nature self-interested, that really seems to conflict with common sense morality, which says, well, often we should sacrifice our self-interest in the interests of others, right? Not my interest to give up the $500 or to spend all this time getting in touch with the guy, but, that's what morality says you should do. I was actually on the other side of this equation once. I lost a wallet in New York, and, a woman found it, actually spent all day tracking me down to get me my wallet back, right? She had an apartment right on Park Avenue. It was grand. I had like $20 in there. I don't think $20 would have meant anything to her. So there wasn't any real temptation to keep my $20 when you have a multi-million-dollar apartment. But, still, it's a pain in the neck to track me down to get my wallet back to me. She's giving up her self-interest, right? All right. So, but let's move on to this issue of egoism. Now, one thing philosophers do, and it's maybe sometimes our endearing habit, is when people make claims about terms like egoism, we will ask what they mean, right? And now this can be a bit annoying, but I think it's important, right? Because we might mean some different things by egoism. I'm going to break this term down a bit more as we go on, but I think there's two different things you might mean by egoism that we should notice just from the start. On the one hand, when you talk about egoism, you might mean psychological egoism. Psychological egoism, as a matter of fact, people do act from self-interest or for selfish reasons. This is a psychological claim about people. This is a claim about what people actually do, what human psychology is actually like. Ethical egoism is a completely different thing. Ethical egoism says people should act from self-interest. Not that people always do act from self-interest, but that they should do that. Ethical egoism will even say acting from self-interest / selfishness is the morally right thing to do. That's not a claim about what people actually do, right? Perfectly consistent with this to say that people often sacrifice their self-interest. Ethical egoism is just saying, well, you shouldn't do that. Okay, so hopefully the difference between these two types of egoism is clear to you guys. Rachel spent some time on it. I'm going to spend a bit more time, go a bit more deeply with psychological egoism. We'll actually, the next couple lectures, talk about psychological egoism. I want to go a bit more deeply into it than he does. Then we'll move on to ethical egoism. Okay, so putting ethical egoism to the side for one moment, let's think about psychological egoism. So the question is, what really is psychological egoism? I think we have to break this term down a bit more and go more deeply into it. And why exactly is psychological egoism a threat to morality as we normally think of it? Why is this claim that people are self-interested a threat to morality, which says, well, as we normally think of it, morality says, well, you shouldn't always be self-interested, right? Well, see why this is. I think we maybe need to break down the term psychological egoism a bit more. I think psychological egoism comes in different flavors or, strengths, right? And there's stronger, or what I would call strong or stronger psychological egoism. Maybe we shouldn't think of this as a binary category, but more of a spectrum with strong on one end, weaker on the other. Lots of stuff in the middle or toward one more than the other. But strong or stronger psychological egoism says people always or almost always act for selfish or self-interested reasons. Weak or weaker psychological egoism doesn't make this always or almost always claim. It just says, well, often or usually people act for selfish or self-interested reasons. Now let's think about each of these and ask ourselves why these would be a threat to morality as we normally think of it. And then, I want to ask, what's the evidence that either of these are true? So let's start with strong or stronger psychological egoism. The strongest versions of strong psychological egoism, the really radical ones say, well, it's impossible not to act for selfish reasons. Human nature is such that we can only act selfishly. In anything we do, whatever we might tell ourselves, there is some hidden selfish motivation. And the only reason people will do anything is out of self-interest. Well, clearly, this strongest form of psychological egoism would have an impact on morality. It would mean that we have to rethink morality as we normally conceive of it. A moral theory, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to Kant, but there's this principle that says, ought requires can. And what this means is a moral theory, a good one at least, cannot ask you to do something impossible. And if it's really impossible that people not act from self-interest, if it's really impossible that we sacrifice our self-interest, then a moral theory couldn't ask us to do it, right? Any more than a moral theory could ask us to flap our arms and fly like a bird. If it's impossible, a good moral theory can't ask you to do it. So if this strongest form of psychological egoism is true, we would either have to discard morality as we normally think of it or entirely rethink it so that it appealed to self-interest. If strong psychological egoism is true, then any good moral theory would ultimately have to be a form of ethical egoism because it would have to talk in terms of self-interest. Well, is the strongest form of psychological egoism true? Well, look, this is a psychological claim. This is a claim about what people actually do, right? So we can look at people and ask, well, is it true that they always act from self-interest? Or almost always? Pretty clearly, it isn't true. It is not hard to find cases of people doing things that are contrary to their self-interest. Rachel's gives us the example of Roel Wallenberg, right? Put himself at a lot of risk, comfortable, rich person, put himself at risk to save Jews during World War II, right? Ultimately, Wallenberg lost his life for doing that. And, Wallenberg died in a pretty nasty way in a Soviet prison camp. And he ended up there because he stayed behind to help more Jews escape from the Nazis. Wallenberg knew what he was doing. He pretty clearly sacrificed his self-interest and did it knowingly, right? Rachel's talks about other examples, right? People giving a kidney to a complete stranger. People giving millions and millions of dollars of their own money to help others. Look, you can survive with one kidney, but the evidence is that, kidney donors actually, most cases, doesn't hurt them. They do just fine. But look, getting put under and cut open and recovering from surgery, that's not pleasant. I mean, nobody wants to do that. That's obviously not in people's self-interest, right? You can find more and more and more cases of this, right? These cases are more common than you might think. There's a really nice book, I'll talk about it in later lectures, by Larissa McFarquhar. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. It's kind of shameful that, have a Scottish last name and I can't, maybe I'm messing up Scottish last names, but whatever. But she has this book, Strangers Drowning, and she has all these cases of people just making enormous sacrifices to help others. Cases not uncommon. It's pretty clear people can and do sacrifice their self-interest to help others. Now look, I know what you guys are thinking, and Rachel's talks about this, and the psychological egoist's response will be something like this, right? There's hidden self-interest in these cases. Rachel's talks about the Lincoln story. You can tell other stories with other people, well, Wallenberg just wanted his life to have meaning. He felt so great for helping. That's why he did it, right? The guy who gives a kidney, he feels great about it. It's in his self-interest to feel good about himself. That's why he does this. Well, but is this really convincing, right? I mean, look, we can think about, we can even think about whether it's convincing in these cases, but we can move to other cases where it just looks ridiculous, right? Think about people who win the Congressional Medal of Honor. Usually to win the Congressional Medal of Honor, you have to do something so brave, so risky that you die doing it, right? Most winners of the Congressional Medal of Honor are awarded it posthumously, after death. You think about these cases, from war, someone literally shields the men in his unit from a live grenade by throwing himself on it, right? Now, look, you can give me an interpretation of self-interest. You can tell a story where that's in this person's self-interest, right? Oh, he knew that he would be so sad if he let the other people get blown up, and he was so happy in those 3 seconds before he was blown to bits by the grenade, it was in his self-interest. Now, you can tell that story, right? You can, that's consistent, but it's not convincing, right? It's kind of ridiculous to think that the guy would feel so guilty and that he's so happy for those 3 seconds that sacrificing 40 or 50 years of life is worth it, right? Just on a purely self-interested level. And look, I think we can go deeper with this, right? If you were really a psychological egoist, you wouldn't feel guilty for not helping other people, right? If really all you cared about was your own interest, think about Lincoln and the pigs. If Lincoln really all he cared about was his own happiness, I don't know that Lincoln actually did this. There's a lot of sort of myths around Lincoln. I think this might be one, right? But if Lincoln really did this, if he was a psychological egoist, he wouldn't even care what happened to the pigs, right? I mean, there are real egoists in the world, and when they see another person suffering, they don't think to themselves, oh man, I'm going to feel guilty if I don't help, and I'm going to feel really pleased with myself if I do help. No, what they think is, sucks to be that guy. I'm glad I'm not him, right? So for it even to be the case that you get satisfaction from helping or feel guilty from not helping, it pretty much seems that you have to take an interest in other people's well-being and how they're doing. If you don't, if you're a real egoist, you would never feel guilt for them suffering or pleasure for helping them in the first place. Now look, psychological egoists can, I think, they can try to account for all this. They can tell a consistent story. They can give you an explanation, right? You cannot show that the psychological egoist is inconsistent. But that doesn't mean very much at all, right? There's a lot of scientific claims, there's a lot of empirical claims that are completely ridiculous, but you can't show that the other person is inconsistent. I mean, sorry, one of these days I'm going to have a flat earther and this person's going to be mad. I can't wait to have the course evaluations that rant about how I pick on flat earthers, but whatever. Anyway, let me pick on flat earthers some more. It actually, there's a really good documentary on flat earthers. I can't remember the name of it. Just Google Netflix flat earther documentary. And what's interesting about it is, these guys will actually, they believe in flat earth so much that they'll do pretty elaborate, sometimes pretty well-designed scientific experiments to show that the earth's flat. Now, big shocker, big surprise, any well-designed experiment to test the hypothesis that the Earth is flat is actually going to show you that the Earth is not flat. So the film actually shows these guys doing some of these experiments, ones with the gyroscope, that's really good at positioning it, that's supposed to show, well, people aren't moving in a curve. Lo and behold, it shows people are moving in a curve. Another one, they project a beam of light. And if the Earth's flat, it shouldn't matter how far away the beam is going to hit on a level. Lo and behold, the beam actually hits way higher than it should because you're moving on a curve moving down, right? Now, what's interesting about this is in both of these cases, the flat earthers have elaborate explanations as to why the experiments don't actually show what they clearly show. But that doesn't do anything to show that the Earth is flat, right? In fact, these cases do a lot. These experiments show that these people are wrong, right? In the same way, the psychological egoist, the strong psychological egoist who says people are always self-interested, he can give you some kind of explanation for apparently selfless behavior. He can maybe give you an explanation in terms of any selfless behavior that you see that actually makes it selfish, right? That doesn't mean it's a good explanation. I think when you get down to it, when you start thinking of cases like Congressional Medal of Honor winners or people like Wallenberg who sacrificed their life, the psychological egoists, the strong psychological egoists at least, their explanation starts to sound a lot like the flat earthers, right? I can explain this data that doesn't fit with my theory, but to explain it, I have to tell you a ridiculous, elaborate story. And to just take this stuff at face value, people can and do act for selfless reasons. The earth is round, not flat. It's a lot simpler, a lot more convincing, a lot less elaborate story. So our evidence is the earth is round, and guess what? People can and do act for selfless reasons. The fact the flat earther and the egoist can tell us stories to account for that, that doesn't really mean much.